Hello and welcome to Disability Literacy. My name is Rob Wells. I'm the moderator on this panel, and we're going to be talking about disability in specifically how it relates to writing. This is a writing panel, so we're going to be talking about disability in fiction, in the writing process, both as writing if you have a disability and what are the hindrances or the advantages of that, and then also what are, when you are writing about a disability, what goes into that. So we're going to talk about all that. I want to go through the panel really quick, have everybody introduce themselves, talk about what they write, why they're here, and then also Robin has a great introduction about some etiquette in speaking about disability. So Robin, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Robin Glassey, and I'm a clean YA fantasy author. I also do some middle grade and some nonfiction writing. And as far as my background, I come from a variety of places in terms of disability and mental health. I graduated from BYU with a bachelor's in psychology and worked on an adult psychiatric unit. And as far as disability goes, I have some children who have been diagnosed with some things, and I myself have some things, and I'm sure I'll share some of that as we go along. And in terms of some basic etiquette, with referring to disabilities, it's important to remember that if you're referring to someone who has a disability, it's a person with a disability, and somebody who doesn't, it's person without a disability, versus using the word normal. Because language is very powerful, and we want to make sure that we're being respectful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Scott, do you want to go? I'm just going in the order that you're appearing on my screen. But Scott, you're at the top.
Sure. My name's Scott Huggins, and I write just about every kind of spec fic there is, a little bit. So I've got my third book coming out this year. I'm on the panel because my own life and some of my loved ones have been impacted by disability, and I've written a number of stories featuring characters with disabilities.
Thank you. Jay, how about you?
Hi guys, I'm Jay Boyce. I write the Touch of Power series, and I'm working on another one right now. I am on this panel because I have an autoimmune disease, and I suffer from a myriad of cascading health issues because of that. My main character in my Touch of Power series is someone who was hospitalized for a majority of her life and gets to experience a new world. I write game lit, if you've heard of that. So video game fantasy, basically. So that's what I do.
Great. And Shannon?
Hello, my name is Shannon Babb. I'm one of those few lucky people that get to work full-time as a writer. I'm a curriculum developer for Central Utah Water Conservancy District, and I write disability fiction as a hobby. I'm on this panel because I have a hearing impairment. It's called CAPD, so I'm actually reading the lips of the panelists as we go along on this panel.
I will
Wonderful.
Also point out, actually, I forgot about this. I also work with deaf students for universities. I transcribe their classes for them. So that is also something that I have done for many years.
Wonderful. My name is Robison Wells. I am the author of 15 novels, New York Times bestseller. I have schizophrenia and OCD, which I've suffered from for 12 years. And I say suffered legitimately. It's been suffering. I was diagnosed officially with schizophrenia 4 years ago, but I've had it for 12 years. And I write extensively on disability topics, particularly short stories. I've been published in several anthologies. So I want to start off with a story about myself. Like I said, I've got schizophrenia and OCD, and about 3 years ago, I picked up a book by John Green, who super famous author, writes young adult. I write young adult, and he had a book out that was about an OCD character called Turtles All the Way Down. And I read this book, and I was so angry at the way that OCD was portrayed in this book. I thought he got all of this wrong. Couldn't he have done any research? Couldn't he have? I mean, this is not OCD. And then after I finished the book, I found out John Green has OCD and he was describing himself. So my question to you, panelists, is everyone experiences disability in different ways. How do you handle that when you write, knowing that the way that you see the world through your disability lens is different than the way that other people see the world through their disability lens?
Yeah, I think.
Jump in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to remember, Rob, especially if you're a person without a disability, is to know that you can't speak for everyone who has that, because there's such a range, right? A range of experience. As a mom raising 3 boys with ADHD, they're all very different in what goes on. And same thing with RAD. And as I have joined different Facebook groups and talked with different parents and come to find out what their experiences are, there are some things that resonate with me that I go, oh yeah, that's exactly how I feel. That's what I'm going through. And then other things that I go, you have got to be kidding me. I can't even relate to that. Like, how do you deal with that? And so that is really important to remember, that experiences aren't going to be the same. Some things are going to be different, as well as your own personal lens. We all come from different backgrounds, different families. You're adding like lens upon lens upon lens of experience that also can color what you see, in addition to whatever that disability is. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Shannon, it looks like you have something.
Write a character. Yes, that character may have a disability, but it doesn't matter if you have a disability or not. Your character will tell you how they will behave. They may use different coping mechanisms because of their disability, and that's really where disability can color your fiction. But if they are reacting realistic to that character, you're a lot more forgiving if you messed up, because it's true to their character and you know why they're reacting the way they are.
I will say that disabilities may not be like, everyone has it different, but one of the things that is the same throughout everything is that everyone struggles. Like, whether you are a person with or without a disability, everyone is struggling with something. And so if you just look at it through that lens, that's kind of what I try and do, is that, if you're, like Shannon said, if you're writing a character, you write how that character will, and don't worry so much about the disability. Be true to the character.
Thank you. Scott, did you have anything to add?
I'm not sure I'm going to say anything terribly useful, because I think it's been covered. So I think just go on. I'll jump in at some other point. Okay.
Well, let's jump into that. How do you write, if you're going to sit down and you're going to write a story about someone with a disability, and let's say, I mean, all of us here have been impacted by disabilities, but if you are going to write a story about a disability, what research do you need to do into that? How do you go about the research? And how do you make it authentic?
I would say stories, really. Reading the stories of different people. There's a lot of resources online of just different people who talk about whatever they're going through. And it's really easy to find people who are talking about, well, what are the struggles that I face? What are the things that I have to worry about in my daily life? And so you can actually just go online and find a bunch of that stuff that is a good resource.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. A synthesis of a number of stories can give you at least some appreciation of the type of spectrum. I mean, we've been talking about that's so important, that not everybody's experience will be the same. So, what are some examples of the places on that spectrum? Then you kind of get a better idea of what your range of reactions people may have.
For me, I kind of start with the technical definition, the technical information of something. If that makes sense, like I want to know, okay, how is this defined? What is the the physical or the scientific basis for this? And then I start branching out to those personal stories, because I want to know how that impacts you the most, right? So when my kids were first diagnosed with things, I wanted to know what are the technical definitions of this. I wanted to be able to understand it first. How does this work? And then it was hearing from other parents, their experiences, that helped me gain that greater. It's like widening the perspective, right? I'm here, and then it's widening it and opening it up. The true understanding of something, how to really, really understand it, really comes from experiencing it yourself. It really does. So for me, understanding trauma, PTSD, those kinds of things, that understanding hasn't really come until experiencing it myself and going, oh, now I get it. Now I understand those moments when my kids have just been kind of like standing there frozen, unable to speak, unable to communicate. And I'm going, just tell me. Just communicate. Why aren't you communicating? And then I've been in those moments going, what do I say? I want to say something, but what are the consequences of speaking up? So it's not until actually being there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But sometimes you're not going to be able to be in that situation yourself. And the best that you can do is listen to or read the stories and the experiences of other people. And you just do your best to imagine yourself in that position, or imagine your character in that spot and what they would do.
Yeah. How about you, Shannon?
I tend to write things where the character has a disability. Hopefully that isn't what's driving the plot, but we see ourselves in the character because of those little quirks, those coping mechanisms that help them navigate. So I try to go through a day looking from the perspective of the character, trying to figure out, okay, what parts of the built infrastructure are going to cause conflicts, or going to require them to have coping mechanisms? What parts of society are going to require them to have coping mechanisms to get across that barrier? And then I ask people that I know within the disability community that utilize some of those coping mechanisms, and we workshop it. We talk about, okay, what would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? And that helps make the story more authentic, because you're looking for specific barriers, specific reasons why they have to navigate the world in a way that someone without that disability wouldn't even think about.
Okay, so Shannon, you talked about talking about other people in the disabled community. How do you guys feel about the use of sensitivity readers? Are they a necessary thing? If they are, when you work with them, how is that relationship? And what instructions do you give to them? What do you expect back from them? And what is that relationship like between you and a sensitivity reader? And is it necessary?
Well, on the last panel I was just listening to, they were talking about this with the female protagonists, and sensitivity readers are important, I think, just because you don't always know. You can't write only what you know. It's really hard to write just one person, because there are so many people in a book and in a story. You're gonna be, I'm gonna write male characters, so all of those things, you're gonna write something that you don't personally know. It's important to have a multitude of varieties so that you notice and that they can talk to you about those things. So if I'm doing something that's, you got to understand every character is different, but it's still important to know some of the sensitivity things that you might not be personally aware of that are still important to address.
I view my sensitivity readers are critical. Nothing that I write goes without it, because growing up, I did not see myself in literature, and that's why I write disability fiction, because it was something I longed for so badly as a child, was to see characters like myself. And so I want to make sure that kids can see it and learn that they're not alone. And that's critical. Now, I will tell you, sensitivity readers, if you get it right, it can be a brutal process. They can tear you to shreds when you get it wrong. And having that open communication and honesty so your sensitivity readers feel comfortable giving you feedback when you do it wrong makes the story, when it's complete, just that much better.
Can't be defensive.
And I think it's also important to note too is, who are you giving it to read? And remember that range of experience. If you remember what Rob said at the beginning, when he read that story, he felt angry and felt like that story was wrong, that it didn't fit his experience. And then he found out that person, well, who was the author again, Rob?
John Green.
John Green, that he had that same condition, right? So kind of keeping that in mind as well. Okay, who am I giving this to read? Because you might have that same experience where that person says, no, this isn't correct. And yet really maybe what they're saying is that I'm not experiencing this exact same thing, and so I'm telling you that it's wrong. Does that make sense? Just kind of keep that in mind.
Swapping advice rather than taking everything they say as the gospel truth.
Right.
Okay, so I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction, and in my research for this, I came across a test. And I want to know what you guys think about this, pro or con. I don't have any. I have my thoughts on it, but it's not anything that I'm married to. I just want to know what you feel about it. So, as writers, you've probably heard of the Bechdel test, which is talking about women representation in books and movies. Someone came up with a disability Bechdel test, which asks the following questions. In your fictional narrative, does a work have more than one disabled character? Number one. Do the disabled characters have their own narrative purpose other than the education and profit of the non-disabled character? And is the character's disability not eradicated either by curing or killing? I find these questions really interesting because they're definitely things that we have all seen in what I would refer to as kind of stereotypical disability fiction, which is its own whole genre. Do you guys agree with these questions, with this test to run against books? Or do you think that there are things in this that shouldn't apply?
Well, I mean, I think that's a decent start. I guess the only one I would seriously call into question is the one about, is there more than one disabled character in your text? Because at least from my own research and my own experience with my loved ones who are disabled, my own experiences suffering from depression, one of the things that I hear a lot, well, I mean, it's like what Shannon said. You want to see yourself represented. Does that not mean that, to a certain extent, one of the struggles of disability is the feeling that you are alone in that experience? So, I mean, I can see why you might not want to highlight, like, this is my disabled character. That can be done in a lot of bad ways. But I don't think that having only one disabled character is ipso facto a bad thing.
We have a request for the questions again, by the way.
You want to hear the questions again? Okay, the first one was, does a work have more than one disabled character? Do the disabled characters have their own narrative purpose other than the education and profit of a non-disabled character? And is the character's disability not eradicated either by curing or killing?
Well, I think the problem that I have, first of all, is with using the word disability, and I think there would be a lot of people who would have a problem with it, because there are those who don't identify as being disabled, right? The word itself is, we have it as a legal definition in order to access certain kinds of benefits. So there are those who don't identify as being disabled. So then to say, okay, now you have to answer this questionnaire and plug this in, when they may be saying, well, but I don't consider myself to be disabled, yet I have these conditions. Does that make sense? So the word itself can be problematic for individuals, where, yeah, I have to, legally, I have to wear this label in order to access benefits, but personally, I don't feel that way about myself. And so why should I then apply this to my book and fill this out? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that
there's a new test as well that's called the Mako or Maki test. That's came about because of the Pacific Rim. But it's a similar thing, basically, almost exactly those questions, except for with a female character, basically. But I think those questions are fairly okay, except for the last one. I don't actually completely agree with, especially in my books, because, like, I have healing magic. So a lot of the physical ailments, at least, can be cured. It's not always easy, but it is possible. So I think that's something that's not necessarily a mark, because there are a lot of societies and things where books, futuristic, sci-fi, or fantasy, where stuff can be healed. A little bit harder with mental, or just things that aren't obvious. Like, my brother is brilliant, and he'll read an entire book, and he had this in a computer programming test once. He read the entire book, and he went to take a test, and the teacher said, "You missed this question," and my brother's like, "That wasn't in the book." And they said, "No, there was a graph on page 45," and he's like, "No, there wasn't. There was nothing there." And they opened the book and the graph was there, but my brother doesn't see things. He doesn't process pictures. So the words were fine, and anything that had word content were great, but anything that had a visual, you just didn't process. And so I think one of the things that's been an interesting change for me is the move away from like handicap spaces to accessibility spaces. It's not that people are handicapped, it's that we're making it accessible for all different types of people.
And I actually
Yes,
had
yeah.
an issue with the other side of the question, which was the death aspect. When you look at disability fiction that's in that is widely read, The Fault in Our Stars is a very good piece. And they acknowledge that sometimes you don't get
kills you.
to live the full amazing life that you wanted. You make the most of what you have. And that is one of the things that makes that book so accessible. And it also cheapens other characters like Ahab in Moby Dick. He is a very powerful character with a disability, and just because he dies at the end of the book and gets that narrative closure doesn't make him any less of a incredibly powerful character in literature.
I feel that one of the I feel like we're sort of skating over something that's that is, I think, implicitly understood. The idea that there is that what we're trying to avoid is not so much that disabled people should never die or die heroically. I mean, why should a disabled character not be able to choose to die heroically? I mean, that's what people without disabilities are allowed to do. But the idea that we're trying to avoid is the better off dead trope. That it is better to die than live. I mean, but even that, if done correctly, I mean, I can certainly see where it would be natural for somebody who has lived without a disability their entire lives and suddenly finds themselves severely disabled would at least go through a stage of, holy crap, I'd rather die now. That's not healthy, but it's understandable.
And I definitely
Surely.
agree with that, because like when I was diagnosed with my autoimmune disease about 4 years ago now, I had to completely change my life. Like all of the foods that I was eating, I found out I was allergic to, basically. And that's why I was sick for so long. And so like all of those things, it like becoming or having a disability that you find out about or that comes later in life can be a lot harder than something I feel like that you had your whole life, because you now have the dichotomy of, well, I was living differently, but now I have to try and cope with this new reality. And that's really the same for most things. Like you get a sudden change and you have to learn to cope. And it's not always easy.
Well, I think that again, for me, I sort of look at meanings of words or whether we're really examining it consciously or subconsciously. And again, looking at disability, as a society, when we look at this word, the very word itself has dis on it. And what is dis? What does that imply?
Negative.
It implies negative, right? It implies negative. And so you can see that in and of itself, how might you feel, or how might others feel like, well, no, I don't want to acquire this, and so that's why, I say that there are those who like, no, this isn't something that a label that I want to attach to myself, or even for me with the things that sorry, this is the time of day where my brain is like slowing down and it's harder for me to find my words, that I don't look at myself and the challenges and go, well, I have disabilities. And yet when you look at the definition of how it impacts your daily living, the things that I have, it impacts my daily living. every single day. But I don't put that label on myself. And certainly when I took a couple of my boys to a transition night, and I have never used that word with them, but when I took them to a transition night and they saw that, I saw the look on one of my boys' faces, like, that's how you see me? And it broke my heart. Like, no, it's not, but this is what is required in order to jump through hoops for certain programs. And I think that's an important thing as writers, that if you are going to write, how do your characters feel about these words? Is this how they perceive themselves? How do others perceive them? Right? Makes sense? How do I view myself? How do I feel about myself with whatever condition it is, whether temporary or permanent?
Okay, so I think from all of the comments that we've gotten, especially regarding those quotes, we're pretty much saying that in all of these cases, the answer is it depends, and there shouldn't be any really hard and fast rules in regard to that. I would ask this. We all are associated with disability. We all are sensitive, probably more sensitive to disability issues than the people who are not affiliated with disability. Are there rules that you think should apply when you are writing about a disabled character?
Don't make them a trope.
Have respect for the human condition. Like, make them a person and not a disabled. Like, don't have their one personality trait be a disability. Make them a person.
Yeah. Disabled people with disabilities have personalities. Disabilities aren't personalities. Yeah.
And I would say also, look up what is the current terminology too. Yes, Shannon.
I have words about this because in the disability communities, you have factions.
Yes,
so
and
this is
that's
a
also
whole lot
important to
harder than
understand
you
too.
think.
Yes.
Because I have the deaf community saying I can't use the term hearing impaired because it is wrong and it is demeaning and all of that. I have significantly better hearing than most people. I just can't understand a word it means. I don't get meaning from sound. I get meaning from other context. So my ears are fine. My hearing is impaired. Different groups end up having very different terms. When you look online, you will have a couple of dominant groups that will yell and scream about which terms are the ones you have to use. And that's may or not that it's not as clear cut as the internet will tell you.
Yeah,
and I have strong opinions on that.
Yes, and I think that in and of itself is important to understand that that there are still going to be varying opinions, right? Just like with this, just like this spectrum or this rainbow with each condition, that you're going to have varying experiences and varying opinions. The same thing is going to be with language. And at the same time, there is still going to be, you're still going to find some terms that just really aren't going to be acceptable and just really aren't going to be okay. But
I think it is important to know that the terms do change over time.
Yes.
And that, because Shannon's is absolutely right. Like, when I said I work with the deaf community earlier, I was like, oh no, am I going to get ragged for that? Because I'm like, some of my students might want to be called hard of hearing. Some of my students are okay with deaf. Some are okay with hearing impaired. Like, it's a basket case of I don't like to address it usually.
And sometimes that even just comes from your growing up, right? Like what you've grown up with, what your family has referred to, and then you go out into the community and the community says, no, that's not okay. And you're like, but that's what I grew up saying in my house. Like, that's how we referred,
That's what I say about myself. Like,
right.
Certain groups have particular histories that will take time to unravel as you get to know the group. You know that the deaf community and the hearing impaired community, both the little D and the big D, there is fascinating fights and conflicts that go on all the time.
Like they fight about like if you get an implant or not. Like some people say like if you get an implant, you're making like you're being untrue to your like heritage and your stuff. I'm like, but it's part to help you. Like, yeah, it's a messed up thing sometimes.
Yeah. So
it's conflict.
It is conflict, and so it's all the more reason to get feedback when you are pursuing writing a book about something and getting as many different point of views as you can. So let's talk without turning into a rant session, which this could very easily turn into. What are your biggest pet peeves when it comes to the portrayal of disability in fiction? And I'll start. My number one is a very popular TV show, Criminal Minds. Ran for like 9 seasons, super popular. Every serial killer had a mental illness, and that's why they were a serial killer. And they would kill because they had OCD, or they would kill because they had whatever. And drove me out of my mind. What are some of the things that you guys see in fiction that drive you crazy about disabilities?
One of the in the chat they were talking about Mice and Men, and that's one of the ones that I hate as well. I read it in high school, and there are some people who remain more childlike in their dispositions. But the main, a big trope is to have it be the slow-witted, dull character who just doesn't understand things. And I think that's one of like the poster child of disability that most people think of, and I dislike that trope.
I think for me, it's the ADHD hyperactive, and that it doesn't, because now the term is ADHD, which also includes ADD, and you don't see all of the other aspects of it. So you don't see the non-hyperactive, as much of the inattentive. It's always the hyperactive side of ADHD. So I think being able to see the greater picture of what ADHD can look like.
I think for me, there's a certain portrayal of physical disability that always gets up my nose, and it's when you will get a character who will suffer a traumatic amputation, or possibly it tends to be with mobility things. There's a traumatic amputation, or there's a spinal injury, and they linger on just enough for the death to be kind of ultra horrifying, and then they die. And you just kind of feel like you didn't want to get into. You just wanted to play a disability for extra horror. You didn't want to actually deal with a character that, I don't know, might have been interesting here. There was something that could have been fascinating, and you just like, nah, I don't want to deal with that. Screw it. It's like you can almost predict it. It's like, okay, and they're going to linger and die. Okay, done.
I'm kind of annoyed that we cherry pick the disabilities that get to be in fiction. Again, I didn't get to see myself growing up until I found my disability in a Star Trek novel. It's still to this day the only time I have seen myself in fiction. We need to broaden the tent a little bit so that the tentpole disabilities aren't the only ones we include.
So let me
I think that's probably true.
hit that as we're running low on time. The issue of representation in fiction that Shannon has hit on several times. We want to see representation of disability in fiction. Do you guys feel a responsibility as authors associated with disability to write disabled fiction, or do you, I guess that's my question, do you feel a responsibility to write about it or to include it in some way, or is it just something that that you can write whatever you want to write about and not?
For me, my sense of responsibility actually comes through in my nonfiction, and in my fiction, if it happens to fit with whatever or whoever the character is, then it's not the main focus. It's just a part, just one aspect, because that's how it is with individuals. It's not not everything about them. It's just a part. But for me, it's more in my nonfiction, in my advocacy efforts and blog posts and things that, because that's just something that I feel passionate about with, I'm a mental health advocate. And so that's my nonfiction stuff that I do.
Great.
I personally feel like I don't feel a responsibility to write about it, but it's a struggle that I include naturally in characters sometimes, because I think a lot more people struggle with stuff than we realize. Like, I can't tell you how many, pretty much every author that I've ever talked to has some form of, mental blockage that, they start with imposter syndrome or depression, or, there are so many things that most authors at some point go through, that everyone is struggling with something, and, it just may not always come through.
Yeah. Well, we are.
I feel
at 5
responsible.
minutes. Oh yeah, you do.
I feel responsible, but I fully admit that it's baggage from my childhood. So I'm filling in gaps.
Great.
Yes.
Well, we have 5 minutes left. Do we have any questions from the group?
We have a number of audience questions. Erica Marler asks, what are some positive examples that you have seen of characters with disability? Which I think you may have already talked about a little bit, but if you could just maybe recap, each mention one.
I really like the Miles Vorkosigan series by Lois McMaster Bujold.
Can you elaborate on that?
Miles suffers from a comparatively mild form of brittle bone disease, but he grows up in a physical and military obsessed culture. So, in this big society that values perfect he-men, he is a fragile dwarf with a brain. And that impacts him all the time. He tries to navigate his society by making his brain stand in for the brawn he lacks.
I'm gonna say there is a book called Ritualist by Dakota Kraut. It's a Gamelet book, but there is a character named Jackson there, and in the game he has less than 10 intelligence. And that is one of the things that actually like twists how he views reality. And it plays on how different things like that can be. I really enjoy it. It's not completely, but I think it counts.
That's great.
My brain's not, I can't even think of one right now, and I'm going to forgive my brain for that. So I hope you'll forgive me too.
That's all right.
I'm going to say Full Metal Alchemist. Now, that is a society where disabilities are compensated for, and it's just become a fabric of their society.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. The one that strikes me that I've always really liked is Professor X in his wheelchair. Professor X is one of the most powerful mutants who chooses to be in a wheelchair for the purpose of having his disability, or for the purpose of having his abilities. He is willing to go through the disability to have his mutant powers. So, what other questions do we have?
All right. Our next question is from Natasha Watts, who asks, what resources do you recommend for finding sensitivity readers with specific disabilities?
Facebook groups. Like I have a whole bunch of like autoimmune support Facebook groups, and I get posts all the time about people who are, just talking about their problems and things that have helped.
And I would even suggest that.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. As you're going to different writing conferences, and as you're networking, and as you're getting to know people better, you'll get an idea of what are the different challenges that people have, and as you're writing something, you'll be able to go, oh, I know so and so who has this particular condition. I'm going to see if they would be willing to read my manuscript, because as I think it was Jay who mentioned that, she knows a lot of different individuals who have different conditions. And so as you're networking and as you're getting to know people better, then you have that wider network of individuals that you can talk to and ask to read your manuscript.
Yeah. By participating in a lot of mental illness anthologies, I have been found by many people and asked to be a sensitivity reader for schizophrenia several times. And it's just by them saying, all right, who in this book is writing about this issue? I'm just going to shoot them off an email, or I'm going to have my agent send them an email and find people that way.
Also, just Facebook groups in your genre. You can do posts similar to that, like, hey, I'm looking for a sensitivity reader for this, and see, like, or on Reddit, things like that. You'll have people who volunteer because they want to see it done right.
Yeah. And there are some sensitivity readers who charge you, some sensitivity readers who do it for the love of doing it.